Hey guys, this is Mark from ShotKit here. I've put together this Sony a7 III review for you after shooting with it for the last 12 months as a wedding photographer here in Australia. I know there's a lot of Sony a7 III reviews out there already on YouTube, but I wanted this one to be different because I've used the camera, like I said, solidly for the last 12 months. I've come from shooting Nikon DSLRs. I've used those for the past 10 years or so, most recently of which the Nikon D750. It's a very popular camera for wedding photographers, and I know that a lot of you out there will be thinking about making the switch to mirrorless from DSLR. So I hope this review will be useful to you. Okay, so first off, why did I decide to switch from DSLRs to mirrorless cameras? I've been using DSLRs, as I said, for the last 10 years, and obviously using them with the OVF, looking through it and taking photos as normal, as most people should be doing. But then I gradually found myself using the live view more and more just to check my exposure without having to take a photo and then chimp afterwards. With the DSLR, obviously, shooting with a camera this far from your face, A, looks ridiculous, and B, is very slow to operate because the live view on DSLRs is clunky, to say the least. So I was looking at mirrorless cameras, and none of them really fit the bill for me as a wedding photographer until the release of this, the Sony a7 III, which incidentally I'm using to film this review. So let's get stuck into point one of why I like the a7 III. This is going to be true for most of you, but making the switch from a DSLR to mirrorless camera, one of the main features is the size and the weight of the mirrorless body. Now, I've got quite big hands, and I know that people even with a smaller hand than me handle the a7 III and remark on how small it is to hold. You'll find that your little finger is actually hanging off the bottom, which can feel a little bit strange, and I actually dislike it quite a lot. I've toyed around with different grips. There's a grip that doesn't contain batteries, there's one that does contain batteries, and there are other cases such as the Garys, and I'll link to all of those below so you can check them out. They basically add a little bit of bulk to the camera. With the Sony's grip, it adds just a tiny bit of metal to the bottom just to rest your little finger on. It's not ideal, but it does the trick. I wish that the Sony bodies would be a little bit larger, so it's great that they're lightweight, but it doesn't really make any sense to me to make them smaller. Nikon with the Z series and Canon with the EOS R series, they're moving in the right direction here, making the bodies a little bit more like DSLR bodies while still taking advantage of the mirrorless weight. On the topic of weight, there's not a huge difference between the D750 and the Sony a7 III, nor will it be if you're coming from quite a small-bodied DSLR. So the size advantage of mirrorless cameras isn't a huge deal for me, A, because I like a decent grip size, and B, because as soon as you attach a lens to the front of the camera, it kind of becomes almost the same size and weight as a small DSLR anyway. One thing I will say about the Sony a7 III is that it's not a particularly nice camera to hold, especially if you're coming from a DSLR. If the a7 III is the first camera that you're picking up, I don't think you'll find anything wrong with it. It's got like a nice deep recessed grip. Button placement is fine as well. But coming from the D750, I did feel that something about the camera, it's not very enjoyable to hold for a long period of time, especially if you don't use a grip when your little finger's hanging off the bottom. It just doesn't feel like an enjoyable camera to hold. One of the things that I do like about the a7 III is the flip-out screen. So I'm used to shooting with the D750 that has a great flip-out screen on the back. The a7 III's is very similar, same size. The operation isn't quite as smooth as on the Nikon, and the implementation of touchscreen on there, it's nice, like you can select focus points and move them around, that kind of thing, but then you can't use it to swipe to the next photo in playback. I just don't think it's very well implemented on the Sonys. It's kind of like a half-baked feature. Alright, onto the autofocus, which should be one of the main reasons why you're looking at this camera. You've all probably read about IAF and the face tracking on this Sony. I've been testing the Nikon Z or Z series cameras and also the Canon EOS Rs. Autofocus on them is decent, but I think the Sony a7 III really blows them out of the water, especially with the addition of the IAF. I've set up one of the back buttons on the Sony to take advantage of the IAF, so I find that shooting the camera away from my face like that after the ceremony when everyone's running to congratulate the bride and groom, I can just hold my button down on IAF and try and compose my shot away from my face and just click the button as much as I want, knowing that the Sony, if it sees an eye in the picture, it will grab it and take a photo. Obviously that's not necessarily going to be the right eye, but you can do things like save people's faces at the start of a wedding into the camera, and the Sony will recognize them in the shot and prioritize them with the focus. Another advantage of the a7 III and mirrorless cameras in general is focus peaking. So if you're a fan of manual focus lenses or use things like tilt shift lenses, focus peaking can be a great feature. I've got focus focus peaking assigned to the delete button, so when I press that in shoot mode, it switches immediately to manual focus and lines a play around the subject when they're in focus. Continuous AF on the Sony a7 III is incredible, and it blows all DSLRs out of the water in my opinion. When the bride and groom are walking towards you at normal pace, like when they're coming down the aisle for example, the Sony a7 III just locks onto their faces and takes photos in focus all the way through, even in low light. If the subject's moving quicker, obviously it does a good job there, but typically DSLRs struggle in continuous AF when the subject's moving forward or backwards. With the Sony a7 III it does a great job of that. Okay, on to image quality. Now the Sony a7 III, and I think any mirrorless camera with a full frame sensor that's been produced in the last couple of years is going to be on par with the equivalent DSLRs. So it's hard for me to say that one is better than the other. One thing that I have noticed with the files out of the Sony is that the colors, especially the skin tones, isn't as good as the Nikons or the Canons out there. If you're shooting straight to JPEG, then I understand that you might want to favor the Canons and the Nikons, but pretty much every wedding photographer out there is going to be shooting RAWs and then applying their own presets. So you will have to play around a little bit like I did coming from Nikon to Sony with your preset to perhaps warm up the skin tones or tweak them a little bit, but once you've got your preset dialed in with this camera, then it's just a matter of applying the preset on import and you'll be back at square one like you would have been on a DSLR. Hope that makes sense. As for dynamic range, now Sony makes the sensors in Nikon bodies, so if you come from the D750 for example and the incredible dynamic range capabilities there, then you won't be missing them on the Sony a7 III. It's got very similar shadow and highlight recovery. I would say that the D750, strangely enough, is slightly better in that regard, but the way that most people shoot, you won't need that extremes on the ends of the dynamic range unless you really bugger up your shot. So I think that the dynamic range on the a7 III will be more than enough for you out there. So one big negative point about the Sony a7 III and other Sony mirrorless cameras that I've used in the past is the menus. Whatever camera system that you come from, I think that you'll find the Sony menus extremely confusing. One saving grace is the My Menu function, which allows you to put your most commonly used menu items in there. Now I know that other cameras have this feature, but it's particularly relevant on the Sonys because their menus are such a mess that you'll definitely need the My Menu. Following on from the menus, the customization functionality in the Sony a7 III is mind-blowing, almost to the point of it being utterly confusing. So you'll spend the first few hours using the camera trying to set up all the different custom buttons, trying to work out what they mean because there's no real good explanation within the menu system. You'll have to Google a lot of the terms because you might not be used to them coming from other camera systems. Once you've got it set up, then you'll probably do some more research or you'll play around with it on the day and realise that you want to change things around again. Long story short, it's quite confusing and overwhelming at first, but once you've got everything dialed in, the customization functions will really make you get the most out of this camera. So one big reason why I didn't upgrade to mirrorless cameras sooner from DSLRs was the battery life. Typically in the past, battery life on a mirrorless camera stood between around 300 to 500 photos. And if you're a wedding photographer like me who shoots in the thousands of pictures, then carrying lots of batteries around with you on a wedding day is a pain in the arse. With the Sony a7 III, the battery life, I'm pleased to report, is excellent. It's on par, amazingly enough, with my Nikon D750, so I can get around 1,000 shots out of one battery, which is incredible if you consider that there's an EVF on all the time with this a7 III. Obviously I do try and conserve a little bit of battery power during the day by switching the camera on and off, so it isn't quite the same as a DSLR where you could leave it on all day and it wouldn't really deplete the battery. Obviously if you leave a mirrorless camera on all day, it will be using the electronics and the EVF and other things, and the battery will run out faster. So I find myself turning it on and off when necessary. On that note, the startup time on the Sony a7 III is great. It's in the milliseconds. It's not quite as fast as a DSLR, but once you get used to it, you can kind of predict and turn it on moments before you actually need it and that kind of thing. If you carry a lot of batteries with you on the wedding day, then I don't see any issue with leaving it on all the time. Another thing about the battery on the Sony a7 III, you can actually charge it using a micro USB. So if you've got one of those portable battery packs that you use to charge your iPhone or whatever, you can actually plug that into the camera and charge the battery. So obviously it needs to be plugged in to be able to charge it, so you're not going to be holding it and taking photos with it attached. But I guess if you're stuck in field and you don't have any battery power left, then it is one good way to carry on shooting. Okay, let's talk a bit about lens availability. Now, if you're coming from Canon or Nikon, you're obviously sport for choice with lenses, and particularly if you need specialty lenses like tilt shifts or fisheyes or really fast glass. So as of now, November 2018, Sony does have some great lenses, and I'll link below to a post that I wrote on my favourite lenses that Sony have currently. Recently, Sigma have announced a native lens selection as well, which I'm yet to look at, but I hear that are very good. With the Sony lenses, they're all technically excellent. They're sharp, they're fast, they're relatively lightweight, the image quality, I can't complain. One thing I will say is that I've yet to find a Sony lens that has some kind of character to it. Now, lens character isn't something that's talked about a lot, but if you come from Canon, then shooting something like the 50mm 1.2, or from Nikon the 58mm 1.4, or the 105mm 1.4, generally the really fast glass has certain character to it, like this kind of 3D rendering of the image, something that can't be replicated even with things like f1.8 lenses. So with the Sony, I've got a 35mm 1.4, which is great. It's on par with the Nikon 35 1.4. It doesn't seem to have that kind of character that I'm kind of looking for sometimes when I'm shooting prime lenses. Okay, so to sum up here, I know this hasn't been a very technical review of the Sony a7 III. You can click the links below to look at the actual specifications of this camera, but since I've been using it for 12 months and this camera's been out for a fair amount of time now, I assume that you already know a lot about the camera itself, and you just want to hear from someone like me who's been shooting with it solidly for the past 12 months, and particularly someone like me who's come from DSLRs to mirrorless straight to this camera. I think a good analogy for using mirrorless cameras or using this Sony a7 III in general coming from a DSLR is that it's a lot like a Tesla, what I imagine a Tesla's like to drive. So I've been in a Tesla, I've never driven one myself, but the Tesla with its electronic motor, its single gear system, its driverless features, its huge iPad-like display in the middle, it's almost like you're driving a computer. It doesn't make any noise, there's no like mechanical feedback that you get when you're driving a manual car. So for some people they love that, like it's the latest technology, it's there to make your life easier. Shooting with it, technically it's great, it's got every feature that you could hope for, image quality's there, all those kind of things are covered. The only thing is, it feels a lot like you're shooting with a computer sometimes, and because of the, not bad ergonomics, but I would say they're not as good as a DSLR, not as good as the latest Nikon and Canon mirrorless cameras either. It's not a very enjoyable camera to pick up, for me at least. So I know a lot of you out there who own the camera will disagree, but for me it's not as enjoyable to use as a DSLR. It doesn't have that mechanical feedback, obviously, because it's a mirrorless camera and there's less moving parts. It just feels like the camera's doing a lot for me. So it makes my job much easier as a wedding photographer, and I can't complain about that, but it does take away some of the fun of shooting. So I wouldn't call it a negative, but it's just something to keep in mind if you're switching to mirrorless cameras or to the Sony a7 III in particular from DSLRs. I'd like to hear your comments on the topic below, and I hope you've enjoyed this review. Make sure you click on the links below to read more about the camera. Hit the subscribe button because I intend to do more videos like this, and I hope to see you on ShotKit. Cheers!